The reflection that stared back at Louisa Ingram from the belly of the silver teapot was a stranger's. A pale, elongated face, with eyes too large and a mouth set in a line of weary resignation. It was the face of a ghost who haunted her own life, polishing the relics of a prosperity she would never share. She dipped the soft flannel cloth into the pot of polish, the sharp, metallic scent filling her nostrils, and continued her work, her movements economical and precise. 1, 2, 3 small circles, then a long, firm stroke to bring up the shine. It was a rhythm that had governed her days for the past 6 years, ever since her father's death had left her and her younger sister Felicity in the care of their Aunt Arabella. "Is it done?" The voice, sharp as a shard of glass, cut through the quiet of the morning room. Louisa did not look up. "Nearly, Aunt." Mrs. Arabella Crane swept into the room, a rustle of black bombazine and disapproval. She snatched the teapot from Louisa's hands, holding it up to the thin morning light that filtered through the grimy windows of the house in Marley. Her eyes, small and dark, scanned the surface for imperfections. "Here," she said, her finger jabbing at a spot near the spout. "A smudge. You are either lazy or incompetent this morning, Louisa. Which is it?" Louisa looked. There was nothing there. A trick of the light, perhaps, or a figment of her aunt's perpetually sour imagination. But to argue would be pointless. It would only prolong the inspection, invite further criticism, and likely result in a forfeited meal. "My apologies, Aunt. I will see to it." "You will," Mrs. Crane affirmed, setting the pot down with a sharp clank. "And I shall be docking a penny from your allowance for the waste of polish and my time. See that the rest of the service is flawless." She turned her attention to the other end of the room, where Felicity was arranging a small bouquet of wilting flowers in a vase. "Felicity, my dear, Mr. Garrick will be calling this afternoon. Wear the blue silk. It brings out the color of your eyes." Felicity, whose beauty was as effortless as Louisa's, was overlooked, beamed. "Oh, Aunt, do you really think so?" "I know so," Mrs. Crane said, her tone softening into a cloying sweetness reserved only for her favored niece. "A girl with your face and my guidance can secure a very comfortable future. Mr. Garrick is a man of ambition." Louisa's hands, steady as always, continued their work. She did not cry. She had learned long ago, at the age of 18, that tears changed nothing. They did not soften her aunt. They did not restore her father's modest fortune, and they did not mend the fractured life she was forced to lead. Competence was her only shield. She managed the household accounts down to the last half penny, stretched the meager budget to keep food on the table, and mended the linens until they were more thread than cloth. She was the invisible engine that kept the dreary house running, and for her efforts she was granted a roof over her head and a pittance that was more often docked than paid. In the small, cold attic room that was hers, hidden in a drawer beneath her plain chemises, was her only treasure. A small bird carved from apple wood, its right wing broken at the joint. Her father had made it for her the week before he died. It was the only thing of beauty that was truly hers. Later that week, a notice appeared on the board in the village square of Marley. It was written in a stark, masculine hand on a plain sheet of paper, a stark contrast to the florid advertisements for patent medicines and lost livestock surrounding it. It requested the services of a clerk or assistant, someone with a neat hand and a mind for organization, to aid in the cataloging and assessment of the Heron Court estate.
The property had stood empty for years, a hulking stone ghost on the edge of the county, belonging to some distant titled family who had long since forgotten it.
The notice was signed simply, G. Moss, Agent. Louisa read it on her way back from the baker's, the scent of fresh bread a small comfort in the damp air. A kernel of impossible hope lodged itself in her chest. A position, paid work, a life beyond her aunt's suffocating orbit. She knew the estate ledgers, had studied her father's account books until she understood them as well as she understood her own name. She had the skills. That evening, she broached the subject. "Aunt, I saw a notice in the village. An agent requires an assistant for the work at Heron Court." Mrs. Crane looked up from her mending, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "And? I believe I am qualified. I could apply." Her aunt gave a short, sharp laugh. "You? And who would see to this house? Who would manage the marketing, and the mending, and the polishing? Do you think I keep you here for decoration? Furthermore, what would people say? My niece, working as a common clerk for some unknown man at a derelict estate. The shame would be unbearable." Felicity chimed in, her voice light and unthinking. "But Louisa is so clever with figures, Mama. Perhaps it would be a good thing." "Hold your tongue, Felicity," Mrs. Crane snapped. "You do not understand these matters. The subject is closed. Louisa, you will not be applying. It is wholly inappropriate." The kernel of hope withered. But later that night, in the cold privacy of her room, something else took its place. A quiet, stubborn defiance. She had 26 years, and not a single one of them had been her own. She thought of the endless silver to be polished. She thought of the pennies docked for imagined flaws, and she thought of the broken-winged bird in her drawer. By the light of a single flickering candle, she took out a sheet of plain paper, the last of a small supply her father had left her, and she began to write. She did not plead or embellish. She simply stated her qualifications: a clear hand, a comprehensive understanding of double-entry bookkeeping, experience in household management, and a meticulous attention to detail. She signed it, Louisa Ingram, sealed the letter, and the next morning, on her way to the market, she slipped it under the door of the solicitor's office where the notice had directed applications to be sent. She expected nothing. It was merely an act of self-preservation, a message sent to herself that she still existed. Gideon Devereux, who, for the purposes of his stay in Marley, was calling himself Mr. Moss, sat in the dreary back room of the solicitor's office, a pile of letters before him. He despised this part of his life. The fawning, the flattery, the cloying scent of desperation that rose from the pages. He had inherited Heron Court from a distant cousin, but what he had truly inherited was a mess of debt, corruption, and neglect, presided over by a steward he'd already dismissed for gross incompetence. He had come to Marley himself, under an assumed name, because he was tired of being the Duke of Kestrel Chase. He was tired of the fortune hunters, the sycophants, the endless parade of people who saw his title, not the man. His wife had been dead for 3 years, a quiet, gentle woman who had understood his need for silence, and since her passing, the world had seemed garish and loud. He wanted truth, plain, unvarnished, and solid. He picked up another letter, written in a looping, feminine hand on scented lavender paper, extolling the writer's delicate sensibilities and noble heart. He tossed it onto the discard pile with the others. He was about to sweep the entire lot into the fire when he saw the last one, a single sheet of plain, honest paper folded neatly. The handwriting was clear, precise, and without affectation. The letter listed skills, not virtues. It was a document of competence. There was no plea for sympathy, no mention of family or station, just a list of what the applicant could do. It was signed, Louisa Ingram. He read it twice. It was like a drink of cool, clean water after a journey through a desert of sentimentality. He set it aside, separate from the rest. "Mr. Gable," he called to the solicitor, "send a note to this address. I will see Miss Ingram tomorrow, at 10. The interview took place at Heron Court itself. Louisa walked the 2 miles from the village, her best dress darned at the elbows and her stomach a knot of nervous energy. The house loomed at the end of a weed-choked drive, a great gray beast of a place, its windows like vacant eyes. A man was waiting for her on the steps. He was tall, dressed in dark, well-made but unadorned clothes. His face was stark, carved from granite, with a mouth that looked as if it had forgotten how to smile, and eyes the color of a winter storm. He was not handsome in the way Mr. Garrick was handsome. His presence was something different, an unnerving stillness, an absolute authority that had nothing to do with charm. "Miss Ingram," he said. It was not a question. His voice was deep and quiet. "Mr. Moss?" He nodded, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in the mended dress, the worn but clean shoes, the lack of any jewelry or ornament. She felt utterly exposed, as if he were cataloging her poverty with the same dispassion she intended to apply to the house's contents. He led her inside. The air was cold and smelled of dust and decay. In what had once been a grand study, he gestured to a chair. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He pushed a large, leather-bound ledger across the desk. "This is the estate account book for the year 1820. The final balance is incorrect. Find the error." Louisa's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the test. She pulled the heavy book towards her, opened it, and forced herself to breathe. The columns of figures swam before her eyes for a moment, then settled into familiar patterns. She ran her finger down the page, her mind falling into the cool, clear logic of numbers. Addition, subtraction, balances carried forward. It was a language she understood. It took her less than 5 minutes. A transposition of numbers in the quarterly summary for the tenant farms. An easy mistake to make, but a significant one. "There," she said, her finger resting on the offending line. The sum for the rents from Netherfold was entered as £63 and 10 shillings. It should have been £36 and 10 shillings. The error was then carried forward through the rest of the year's accounting. He looked at the page, then back at her. His expression did not change, but she felt a subtle shift in the quality of his attention. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. "You are correct," he said. He was silent for a full minute, his gaze so intense she had to force herself not to look away. He seemed to be weighing something far more important than a simple accounting error. "The position is yours, Miss Ingram," he said finally. "Your pay will be 5 shillings a week. You will work from 9 in the morning until 5 in the evening, 6 days a week. You will be tasked with creating a full inventory of this house and its contents, and a review of all estate records for the past 10 years. You will report only to me. Are the terms acceptable?" 5 shillings a week. It was more money than she had held in her own hands in a year. It was a fortune. It was freedom. "The terms are acceptable, Mr. Moss." "Good," he said, standing. "You will begin tomorrow." As she walked away from Heron Court, the great gray house at her back, Louisa Ingram did not feel the chill of the wind. For the first time in 6 years, she felt the warmth of her own worth. The first week at Heron Court was an exercise in methodical conquest. Armed with a stack of fresh ledgers, a pot of ink, and a quiet determination, Louisa began to impose order on the chaos. She started with the library, a magnificent 2-story room where dust lay like a shroud over everything. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and leather. Mr. Moss, her silent, watchful employer, had given her only one instruction: be thorough. And so she was. She worked her way along the shelves, taking down each book, opening it, and gently brushing the dust from its pages with a soft cloth. She recorded the title, the author, the year of publication, and a brief note on its condition in her neat, precise hand. It was slow, painstaking work, but she found a deep satisfaction in it. Each recorded title was a small victory against the neglect that had consumed the house. She discovered first editions of Dryden and Pope, a beautiful hand-illustrated herbal, and collections of poetry with inscriptions written in a fading, elegant script. She was not merely listing objects. She was uncovering the history of a family, the ghost of a life that had once filled these rooms. Mr. Moss was a constant, quiet presence. He would appear in the doorway of the library, standing there for long minutes, simply watching her. He never offered praise, but he never criticized either. His silence was a neutral space in which she could simply be competent. Sometimes he would take a book she had just catalogued, turning it over in his large hands, his expression unreadable. Once, he found her carefully mending a torn page with a small pot of paste she had asked the housekeeper for. He watched her fingers, deft and sure, align the fragile edges of the paper. He said nothing, but when he left the room, he had left a new, better quality lamp on the table beside her, its wick trimmed and its reservoir full of clean oil. It was his way of speaking. The only other inhabitant of the vast house was a skeletal housekeeper, Mrs. Bess Croft, a woman with a face like a dried apple and a disposition to match. On Louisa's first day, Mrs. Croft had looked her up and down with unconcealed suspicion and grunted, "He's in the study." But as the days passed and the housekeeper saw Louisa's quiet industry, the subtle change began. On the third day, a cup of weak tea appeared on the library table. On the fifth, it was accompanied by a thick slice of bread and butter. No words were exchanged, but the gesture was as clear as a formal welcome. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. Loyalty, Louisa was learning, was not won with words, but with work. At the end of the second week, she moved from the library to the estate office, a small, cold room filled with tin deed boxes and stacks of crumbling papers. Here, the real challenge began. The accounts were a disaster, a tangle of missing receipts, vague entries, and outright fabrications. It was clear the previous steward had been either a fool or a thief, or, more likely, both. As she painstakingly cross-referenced rent rolls with bank deposits, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Rents recorded as paid in one ledger were never deposited. Bills for repairs to tenant cottages were inflated or entirely fictitious. It was systematic theft, cleverly disguised over years. She found the first concrete proof in a diary kept by the previous steward's clerk, a young man who had clearly been terrified of his employer. Tucked between notes about the weather and village gossip were carefully coded entries detailing payments made directly to the steward that never appeared in the official accounts. And one name appeared more than once, connected to these suspicious transactions: Fletcher Garrick. A cold dread settled in Louisa's stomach. Mr. Garrick, the ambitious suitor of her sister, the man her aunt lauded as a paragon of respectability, was somehow entangled in the ruin of this estate. She did not know how or to what extent, but his name was there, a stain on the page. She said nothing to Mr. Moss. Not yet. An accusation required proof, not just suspicion. Evidence. That was what he valued. She would find it. While she worked, her own small world began to shift. The 5 shillings she earned each week felt like a king's ransom. She was able to buy a new pair of sturdy shoes, to replace the ones with soles worn thin as paper. She bought a small packet of proper tea for Mrs. Croft, a gesture that earned her a rare, tight-lipped smile. She even had enough to buy Felicity a length of ribbon for her hair, a small peace offering for the secrecy of her employment. Her aunt, of course, was furious, her anger stoked by suspicion and a loss of control. "Where did you get the money for these things?" Mrs. Crane demanded one evening, holding up the new shoes as if they were evidence of a crime. "I have a position, Aunt. I told you I would seek one," Louisa answered calmly. "You defied me. You went behind my back. You will bring ruin and shame upon this family, associating with that man at that dreadful house." "I am earning an honest wage for honest work," Louisa said, her voice steady. "There is no shame in that." But the shame, it seemed, was coming for her anyway. Rumors began to circulate in Marley, whispers as insidious as the damp that crept into the walls of her aunt's house. They started in the market, passed over teacups in prim parlors. That odd Miss Ingram, the plain one, spending her days unchaperoned with that grim Mr. Moss. What sort of work could it be, really? Fletcher Garrick, with his polished charm, fanned the flames. He would sigh regretfully in public, speaking of his concern for poor Miss Ingram, led astray by a desire for independence. He painted a picture of a vulnerable, foolish girl and a predatory employer. Louisa felt the chill of turned shoulders at church, the sudden silences when she entered the baker's shop. That is how counties turn on their own, quietly, by degrees. Even Felicity was affected. "Louisa, what are they saying about you? Mr. Garrick is so worried. He says this Mr. Moss is not a suitable person for you to be alone with." "Mr. Garrick," Louisa said, her voice tighter than she intended, "should concern himself with his own affairs." The whispers did not deter her. They hardened her resolve. She worked with a ferocity born of quiet anger, digging deeper into the ledgers. And then she found it. A series of letters, bundled together and hidden at the bottom of a deed box. They were from Fletcher Garrick to the disgraced steward, outlining a scheme to purchase several of the estate's most valuable tenant farms at a fraction of their worth, using falsified assessments of the land's quality. It was a conspiracy to defraud the estate of thousands of pounds. The final letter was dated only 3 months prior. Mr. Garrick's ambition, it turned out, was built on a foundation of crime. She sat in the cold silence of the office, the letters spread before her, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. This was the evidence. This was the truth. She gathered the letters, her hands not trembling in the slightest, and went to find Mr. Moss. She found him not in the house, but in the wildly overgrown gardens behind it. He was standing near a crumbling stone wall, looking out over the valley. For a moment, she saw not the stern employer, but a man profoundly alone. The harsh lines of his face seemed softer in the late afternoon light, touched by a melancholy that resonated with her own. "Mr. Moss," she said, her voice quiet. He turned. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of something else as they rested on her. Not surprise, expectation, as if he had been waiting.
I have found something you need to see. She held out the bundle of letters. He took them, his fingers brushing hers. The brief contact was like a spark of warmth in the cold air. He read the first letter, then the second, his expression hardening back into familiar granite. When he looked up, the melancholy was gone, replaced by a cold, dangerous stillness. Mr. Garrick, he said, the name a flat, hard stone in the quiet air. Yes, Louisa said.
He and the former steward were conspiring to steal from the estate. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her face. This is a dangerous thing to have found, Miss Ingram. I am aware, she said, but it is the truth. Truth is often dangerous, he mused, more to himself than to her. He looked from the letters in his hand to her steady face. You are not afraid? Louisa thought of her aunt's petty cruelties, of the whispers in the village, of the long, lonely years. I am more afraid of silence, she said. A flicker of something that might have been admiration crossed his features. It was there and gone in an instant. Thank you, Miss Ingram. I will handle this. He carefully folded the letters and placed them in his breast pocket. The conversation seemed to be over, but as she turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. There is a small plot near the kitchen. I noticed some rosemary still grows there. Perhaps you could tend to it, if you have the time. It was a strange request, a non sequitur. But Louisa understood. It was an offering. A small patch of earth to cultivate, to bring back to life. It was an expression of trust, more eloquent than any words of praise. Yes, Mr. Moss, she said. I would like that very much. As she walked back to the house, she felt as if the ground beneath her feet was, for the first time, truly solid. The next afternoon, Fletcher Garrick called at Heron Court. Louisa saw him from the office window, his carriage gleaming, his posture reeking of self-importance as he strode to the door. Her stomach tightened. He had come to fight. A few minutes later, Mr. Moss summoned her to the study. Garrick was standing by the fireplace, a picture of concerned gentility. Mrs. Crane was with him, perched on the edge of a chair like a vulture, her eyes glittering with malice. Mr. Moss stood behind the great desk, a silent, imposing figure. The air in the room was thick with tension. Ah, Miss Ingram, Garrick said, his voice oozing a false sympathy. We have come out of concern for you. My dear Miss Ingram, it is my unfortunate duty to bring a serious matter to Mr. Moss's attention. Proceed, Mr. Garrick, Mr. Moss said, his voice flat. Garrick cleared his throat. There have been irregularities. A small sum of money, £10, has gone missing from the household accounts, and at the same time, this was found. He produced a small silver locket on a delicate chain from his waistcoat pocket. It was ornate and beautiful. It belonged to the late Duchess. It was kept in a locked box in this very desk. The lock has been forced. Louisa stared at the locket. She had never seen it before in her life. The connection is, alas, unavoidable, Garrick continued smoothly, particularly when a search of the household staff was conducted. Mrs. Crane was good enough to permit a search of Louisa's room. He looked at her with theatrical pity. The missing £10 were discovered in her mattress. It was a lie. A complete, audacious lie. She had her 5 shillings from the previous week, and nothing more. "That is not true," Louisa said, her voice clear and steady, though a cold terror was beginning to creep up her spine. "Louisa, do not make this worse by lying," her aunt snapped. "The money was there, as was this." Mrs. Crane held up a page torn from one of the ledgers Louisa had been working on. "It appears you were attempting to alter the books to conceal your theft." Garrick laid the ledger page on the desk. "The evidence, I'm afraid, is irrefutable. I am so very sorry, my dear Louisa. I can only assume you were driven to it by desperation." Louisa looked from their triumphant faces to Mr. Moss. His expression was impossible to read. He was looking at the evidence laid out before him: the locket, the ledger page, the testimony of 2 seemingly respectable people. He had known her for only a few weeks. She was a poor, unconnected woman with no references. They were established, their word carrying the weight of social standing. Everything he saw, everything he heard, pointed to her guilt. He picked up the ledger page, examining it. He looked at the locket. Then his eyes, those stormy, unreadable eyes, lifted and met hers. The entire world seemed to shrink to the space between them. All the whispers, all the lies, all the years of being unseen and unheard culminated in this single, silent moment. She saw the doubt in his face, the cold calculus of a man who prized evidence above all else. And the evidence was damning. Her heart, which had been so steady, faltered. This was how her small, defiant grasp on freedom would end, in a lie she could not disprove. He held her gaze for what felt like an eternity. He saw the shock on her face, but more than that, he saw the absence of guile. He saw the same unwavering stillness she'd had when she'd identified the accounting error, the same quiet dignity she'd shown when she brought him Garrick's letters. He had spent years surrounded by people who lied as easily as they breathed, their faces masks of perfected sincerity. Her face was an open book of plain, painful honesty. He set the ledger page down. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but it cut through the charged atmosphere of the room like a blade. He did not look at Garrick or Mrs. Crane. He looked only at Louisa. "Did you do this?" It was a simple question, a lifeline thrown across a chasm of deceit. She could have wept with relief, but she did not. Her aunt had taught her the futility of tears. Instead, she gave him the only thing she had left to give: the truth. She met his gaze without flinching, her own clear and direct. "No," she said. "I did not." A long, heavy silence followed her words. Garrick shifted his weight, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his handsome face. Mrs. Crane's lips thinned into a bloodless line. They had expected hysterics, denials, begging. They were not prepared for the simple, powerful weight of that single, unadorned word. Mr. Moss nodded, a slow, deliberate movement of his head. It was not a gesture of dismissal or judgment. It was a gesture of acceptance. He believed her. In the face of all the fabricated evidence, he chose to believe her word. It was a moment that redefined everything between them. It was no longer the transactional relationship of an employer and his clerk. It was an alliance. He turned his cool gaze upon Fletcher Garrick. "There appears to be a discrepancy between the evidence presented and the character of my assistant.
Such a matter requires a more formal setting to be resolved. He walked around the desk, a predator scenting weakness. We will settle this, publicly. I will request that Lady Theodosia Beaumont convene a magistrate's hearing at the town hall, tomorrow at noon. You will present your evidence there, Mr. Garrick, and I— He paused, his eyes locking with Garrick's— will present mine. Garrick's composure finally cracked. A faint sheen of sweat appeared on his brow. A public hearing? That is hardly necessary for such a minor domestic matter. A simple dismissal would suffice. It is no longer a minor matter, Mr. Moss said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than a shout. It is a matter of a false accusation, a matter of slander. And I find I take such things very seriously. Tomorrow, at noon. It was not a suggestion. It was a command. Mrs. Crane looked from Mr. Moss's implacable face to Garrick's sudden pallor, and for the first time, a seed of fear was planted in her stony heart. They had intended to swat a fly, and had instead disturbed a hornet's nest. Without another word, she and Garrick retreated from the room, their victory soured into a dreadful apprehension. When they were gone, the silence that remained was different. It was no longer heavy with tension, but filled with a quiet, unspoken understanding.
He planted the money, Louisa said, her voice barely audible. And the locket. I do not know how. He had your aunt's assistance, Mr. Moss stated, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. He walked to the window, looking out at the drive where Garrick's carriage was hastily departing. He is a fool. He underestimated you, and he has no idea who I am. He turned back to face her. You will need to be at the town hall tomorrow, Miss Ingram. You will need to speak plainly and tell the truth. Can you do that? Yes, she said. It was all that was needed. Go home, he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. Rest. Tomorrow, the truth will have its hearing. Louisa left Heron Court with her mind in a tumult. He had believed her. Against all logic, against all evidence, he had trusted her. It was a gift more precious than any wage, more profound than any praise. As she walked the path back to Marley, she did not feel like a victim. She felt like a soldier girding herself for a battle she now knew she would not have to fight alone. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The town hall in Marley was a stern, gray building, its assembly room dominated by a long oak table and the formidable presence of Lady Theodosia Beaumont. Lady Beaumont was a woman in her late 60s, a widow of a baronet who governed the local laws with a sharp tongue and an even sharper mind. She had seen fools and liars of every stripe and suffered none of them gladly. She peered over her spectacles at the assembled parties, Mr. Garrick looking pale but attempting his usual polished confidence, Mrs. Crane, a study in righteous indignation, and Louisa, seated beside the quiet, imposing figure of Mr. Moss. The room was filled with the town's more prominent citizens, drawn by the scent of scandal. "Let us begin," Lady Beaumont said, her voice crisp. "Mr. Garrick, you have brought an accusation of theft against Miss Louisa Ingram. Present your case, and be brief. I have little patience for theatrics." Garrick stepped forward, laying out his story with practiced ease. He spoke of the missing money, the stolen locket of the late Duchess,
the discovery of the spoils in Miss Ingram's room. He presented the forged ledger page, explaining how it was a clumsy attempt to cover the theft. He was smooth, convincing, and played the part of the reluctant accuser to perfection. Mrs. Crane corroborated his every word, adding her own venomous asides about Louisa's ungrateful and deceitful nature. When they had finished, a murmur went through the room. It looked bad for Louisa. The evidence seemed solid, the witnesses respectable. Lady Beaumont's gaze fell upon her, cool and assessing. "Miss Ingram, you have heard the accusation. What is your response?" Louisa stood. Her hands were clasped before her, the only sign of her inner turmoil. Her voice, when she spoke, was low but perfectly clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "I did not take the money. I did not take the locket. I did not alter any ledger." "A simple denial is not a defense," Lady Beaumont said sharply. "The evidence suggests otherwise. Can you explain how the missing items came to be in your possession?" "I cannot," Louisa said, "because they were not. The money my aunt claims to have found was not mine. The locket I have never before seen. As for the ledger page," she turned her clear gaze on the document, "it is a forgery." Garrick scoffed. "A desperate claim from a guilty party." "Is it?" Louisa's voice remained calm. "I have spent nearly 2 months studying the accounts of Heron Court. The steward who kept those books had a distinctive hand. In his capital letter F, the upper loop was always left open, like a shepherd's crook. On that page, the F is closed. Furthermore, the ink, while similar, is not identical."
If you hold it to the light, you will see it has a slightly browner tint than the iron gall ink used in the rest of the volume. It is a clever copy, but it is not perfect. A silence fell over the room. Lady Beaumont picked up the ledger page, holding it to the window, her eyebrows rising in interest. Garrick's confident smirk faltered. "A compelling observation, Miss Ingram," Lady Beaumont allowed, "but a matter of opinion. It does not disprove the theft." "No," a deep voice said from beside Louisa. "It does not. But this might." Mr. Moss stood up. All eyes turned to him. He was no longer the quiet, grim land agent. He seemed to fill the room with an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "My name," he said, his voice resonating with quiet power, "is not Moss. It is Gideon Devereux. I am the Duke of Kestrel Chase, and Heron Court is my property." A collective gasp swept the assembly. Mrs. Crane's jaw dropped. Fletcher Garrick went white as a sheet. Gideon paid them no mind. He placed a small, leather-bound book on the table before Lady Beaumont. "This is the diary of the former steward's clerk. In it, he details numerous financial crimes committed by his employer, in collusion with another party. A party who, according to these letters," he produced the bundle Louisa had given him, "was actively conspiring to defraud my estate of land and income. That man's name is Fletcher Garrick." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Garrick looked like a trapped animal. "This is slander. Lies. This person is an imposter." "Am I?" Gideon asked softly. He produced a signet ring from his pocket and laid it on the table. The ducal crest was unmistakable. Lady Beaumont, whose own lineage was impeccable, recognized it instantly.
Her expression shifted from stern skepticism to rapt attention. Gideon continued, his voice cold and precise. Mr. Garrick learned that Miss Ingram, through her diligent work, was close to uncovering his scheme. He needed to discredit her. He needed to have her removed. So he conspired with her aunt, Mrs. Crane, to fabricate a theft. A desperate gamble from a man who knew he was about to be exposed. He turned his gaze on Garrick, and it was like being pinned by a shard of ice. The locket you produced, Mr. Garrick? You claimed it belonged to my late wife. You are correct. It did. And it was, as you said, kept in a locked box. What you failed to realize is that my wife had a particular fondness for French craftsmanship. She had the clasp inscribed with her initials and the year of our marriage on the inside. A detail only a member of the family would know. He looked at Lady Beaumont. I would invite you to inspect the clasp. You will find it is entirely blank. The locket is a cheap copy, purchased by Mr. Garrick 2 days ago from a jeweller in Saltcliffe. The jeweller is waiting outside, and he is prepared to testify that Mr. Garrick paid him handsomely for a rush order and a discreet silence. The foundation of Garrick's world crumbled into dust. The truth, methodical and irrefutable, had dismantled his web of lies, piece by piece. He stood, exposed and humiliated, in front of the very people he had sought to impress. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Mrs. Crane let out a strangled sob. I knew nothing of this. He told me. He said she was a wicked, ungrateful girl. You were motivated by greed and spite, madam, Gideon said, his voice cutting her off. You sought to use your younger niece as a key to social advancement through Mr. Garrick, and you were willing to sacrifice your elder niece to achieve it. You are a party to this fraud. Lady Beaumont slammed her hand on the table. Enough! Mr. Garrick, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and for bearing false witness. Take him away. 2 constables who had been standing by the door stepped forward and seized a stunned Fletcher Garrick. Mrs. Crane collapsed into a weeping heap, ignored by all.
The public reckoning was complete. The whispers that had followed Louisa for weeks now turned into murmurs of admiration and sympathy. She had been vindicated, not by hysterics or pleas, but by competence and truth. In the chaotic aftermath, as the room cleared, Louisa stood quietly beside the man she had known as Mr. Moss. He turned to her, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, and the world outside the town hall seemed to fall away. There was no victory in his eyes, only a quiet, profound gravity. It is done, he said. Thank you, she whispered. It was all she could manage. Her composure, her shield for so many years, was beginning to crack. You have nothing to thank me for, Miss Ingram, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. You uncovered the truth. I merely provided the stage for it to be heard. People were staring at them, the humble clerk and the powerful Duke. It did not matter. In that moment, they were simply 2 people who had found an anchor of truth in a sea of lies. He looked at her plain dress and her steady eyes, and he saw the most honest and courageous person he had ever known. He knew what he had to do. Not out of pity, not out of duty, but out of a need as fundamental as breathing. He had come to Marley a hollow man, a title without a purpose, a house without a heart. And this quiet, overlooked woman had, with her meticulous ledgers and her unwavering dignity, shown him the way back. He stepped closer to her, there on the steps of the town hall, in full view of the curious eyes of Marley. He did not care. When I arrived here, he began, his voice low and for her alone. Heron Court was a cold, empty place, a reflection of its owner. You brought order to its chaos. You tended its neglected corners. You gave it the hope of life again. He paused, his gaze searching her face. You did the same for me, Louisa. He used her given name for the first time, and it sounded like a prayer. Her heart, which she had guarded for so long, felt suddenly, terrifyingly open. I am not a man for poetry or grand pronouncements, he continued, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to conceal. I value what is real, what is true. And I have learned that you are the truest thing in my life. Heron Court needs a mistress, not a housekeeper, not an accountant, but a partner to share in its restoration, to fill its rooms with life and warmth. He looked directly into her eyes, and she saw in their stormy depths a devotion that was as plain and solid as the ground beneath her feet. I need a partner. Louisa Ingram, I am asking, plainly, will you be my Duchess? He did not kneel. He did not offer to rescue her. He stood before her as an equal, offering not a title, but a partnership, a shared life. He was asking her to choose, not to be chosen. For a woman who had spent her entire life enduring, the power of that choice was overwhelming. The years of servitude, of being invisible, of polishing another's silver, fell away. She thought of the broken bird in her drawer, a symbol of her own damaged but resilient spirit. And she thought of this man, who had seen past the mended dress and the quiet demeanor to the strength within. He had not tried to fix her. He had simply made a space for her to be whole. A single tear, the first in many years, escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of profound, unutterable joy. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong. Yes, Gideon, I will. 1 year later, the windows of Heron Court blazed with light, spilling warmth onto the newly restored lawns. The scent of beeswax and rosemary hung in the air, a perfume of happy industry. Inside, the house was filled with the gentle murmur of conversation. Louisa, Duchess of Kestrel Chase, moved through the rooms with a quiet grace, her simple silk gown a testament to an elegance that came from within. She was hosting a small gathering for the tenants of the estate, a tradition she had insisted on reviving. In a quiet corner of the drawing room, her sister, Felicity, was carefully pouring tea for Lady Theodosia Beaumont. The past year had been a harsh but necessary education for Felicity. With Garrick disgraced and her aunt living in quiet shame in a distant cottage on a small conditional allowance from Gideon, Felicity had been forced to rely on her sister's mercy. Louisa had given it freely, but with a condition, that Felicity learn to be useful. And so she had. The shallow beauty was slowly being replaced by a young woman of surprising kindness and competence. The sisters were not yet close, but they were no longer strangers. The wound was healing. "Your sister has done wonders with this place," Lady Beaumont remarked, accepting a cup from Felicity. "And with its duke. I have never seen the man smile so much." Louisa, overhearing, felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was true. The granite had softened. The grief that had encased Gideon's heart had finally receded, leaving behind a deep well of quiet contentment. He found her a few moments later, standing by a window overlooking the gardens she had brought back to life. He came to stand behind her, his hands resting gently on her arms. "Happy?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. "I have something for you," he said. He pressed a small, velvet-wrapped object into her hand. It was light and familiar. She unwrapped it carefully. It was her little wooden bird, but it was no longer broken. The fractured wing had been mended, not with glue, but with a sliver of gleaming gold, intricately worked to follow the grain of the apple wood. The delicate repair was both impossibly strong and breathtakingly beautiful. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Gideon." "You mended my house, and you mended my heart," he said softly, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "It seemed only fair that I should mend what was yours." She clutched the small bird, its golden wing warm against her palm. It was no longer a symbol of brokenness endured, but of a strength discovered, and a love that did not seek to erase scars, but to honor them. Together, they stood at the window, the Duke and his Duchess, looking out over the lands they had healed together. Two solitary souls who had found in each other a home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.